Good morning, everyone. Again, our speaker today is Catherine Bukowski. She's a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech, working on community food forests. Today's presentation will run about 45 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes, and then followed by a question and answer session. Just before we get started, let me share a little bit of information. Again, Catherine Bukowski is a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech, and she previously earned her master's degree in Forest and Natural Resources Management from the State University of New York in 2004. For her doctoral work, she is researching the agroecological and community development factors influencing the design and management of community food forests, with a specific focus on social dimensions. And in her presentation today, Catherine is going to be talking about some of these dimensions of community food forests. She has visited food forests across the United States and collected data, and her goal is to help get a better understanding of which factors are most important to stakeholders and to ultimately produce guidelines for best management practices. She will also be publishing a book on the topic with Chelsea Green, with her advisor, John Munsell from Virginia Tech. That's forthcoming in next year. She helps to maintain a small community food forest in Blacksburg, Virginia, at the local YMCA. She has taught an undergraduate agroforestry class, and as well, she helps plan and co-teach advanced agroforestry seminars. She's a member of the E-Extension Community of Practice for Forest Farming. In fact, I think one of the founding members of that group. And she's also a board member for the Association of Temperate Agroforestry. So let's please welcome our speaker today, Catherine Bukowski. Catherine?
Thank you, Gregory.
I'm going
Okay,
to go ahead and mute my
I
mic, just to make sure there's no interference from our end. And then
okay.
so
Okay. I have a lot of slides today. Most of them are photos. Some of them I will be going through somewhat quickly, and then I'm going to go through quickly so that we hopefully have some time to talk about what you see at the end. And the reason I've made this very photo heavy is because during my last few presentations, it seems that people really want to see what these systems actually look like. And so did I. That's part of the reason I did this research. So we're going to do an overview about community food forests and some of the things that I've seen and that I've observed and that I've noticed. I'm going to focus a little less on the social dimensions today. And then we'll discuss what are some of the potential implications for urban agroforestry. So very loosely, I've defined community food forests as a place where people come together to collaboratively grow food using a design that mimics a forest ecosystem. That is at least the premise that these sites are typically designed on. If they always mimic an actual forest ecosystem, is largely dependent on scale. And that's something that I think you'll see as we go through the photos, and we'll also talk about at the end. When I started the research in 2013 online, I was able to find about 40 different food forests in some regard. Now it's over 60. I have not updated this map in the last year, but towards the end of this presentation, we will see that there has been some new food forests coming up in the last year, and I will try to get them added before the year is out. So there's at least 60 plus initiatives, either established or in some stage of planning. I was able to go to 30 different sites, but due to my research criteria, I included 24 of them, which you see in orange. And I was hoping my criteria, oh, there we go. So I needed a site to be open to the public for harvesting, that there were multiple vegetation layers, at least 3, and that there was community participation, with community members being involved in some way. There was a few sites where volunteers were only allowed to have access to the food if they were volunteering, but the volunteering was completely open to the public, and the site wasn't exactly locked. So if somebody was coming by, there was a way to actually get into the site. I did not include food forests on university campuses due to the constant influx and excitement of new volunteers coming in. We just stuck to ones that were within the public realm. For the social dynamics part of it, I used the community capitals framework, which discusses 7 different forms of capital, which are listed here. And these are seen as assets that are already existing in a community that can be used to invest in creating the food forest, but that also, through the process of establishing the food forest, help to build and invest back into these different capitals. So this has provided a framework for me to be able to go through the different interviews that I did with site leaders. I code information, so it's very qualitative, coding what I took away from focus groups. My focus groups were semi-structured. They had the 5 different project management phases. We would walk through how the site was initiated, what did planning look like, the establishment part, ongoing maintenance and management of the site. And in most project management, there is a closing down period, but we just talked about future visions and what would be next for the site. I also did video tours of sites and collected photos. And that's going to give you a lot of the visual information that we look through today. Food forests, this is a very common illustration of the different vegetation layers found in a food forest. For temperate systems, they typically are more mimicking a young woodland rather than a mature forest. So it's a perennial polyculture system. With, if we were to use NRCS language, it might be a multi-story cropping system. But you can see that there's typically a canopy layer, which is the fruit and nut species, some sort of low tree or shrub layer, and below that another lower shrub layer, ground covers, and also including roots and any type of vines in the system. So it's typically portrayed with 7 layers. What this actually looks like on the ground is what we're looking at here. That center tree with some of the shrub species and ground covers planted underneath it. So it very much matches the illustration, and I wanted to show a few different examples of that at different sites. This is one at Beacon Food Forest in Seattle. Again, you can see that structure that was shown in the illustration. This is in Hazelnut Food Forest, Pittsburgh. So I'm trying to show you some of the older systems as well, where you can actually see these different vegetation layers that have grown up. But you can also see in these systems that there's a lot of light still coming through into that understory. And that's something, we have one example of a food forest that is 15 plus years old. And when I get to those slides, I think that you will notice a very different understory. So please note now what you're seeing as a young woodland successional stage. And this arrow is pointing to underneath. Those are all different herbs that are right near that walking path for the ground covers. Here's one last example of that same structure where we see a center tree and underneath different shrub layers. This one is being pretty newly established, so you can see there's still a lot of mulch and not all the ground covers have taken root. At the time that I took this photo, it was still fairly newly established. So that's the basic structure that people are learning about when they're starting to design these food forests. And in permaculture language, some people refer to that as a guild or a polyculture. And the guild would be getting the different plants that serve different functions. So looking at a forest ecosystem, finding plants that are already existing in the forest. What does that forest structure look like? What are edible plants that can be used to replace those different functions and build a forest ecosystem with the edibles? And part of that is, once you get a small little polyculture together, then growing patches of that until you can fill the landscape. So this is, again, a now more broad look at the same food forest that we had, that was in the last slide. I'm just going to flip back really quick. So here we're looking at one singular patch. And then as we zoom out, we can start to see how building a bunch of those polycultures starts to fill into in the landscape. And that's what these community food forests are doing on a larger scale. So here's another one, and I'm going to put on my pointer. You can see where these different polyculture center spots have been designed, and then the ground covers are filling in between. Again, this has been pretty common across the sites. Here is an older site. This one is in Santa Barbara, California. And what I put this slide in because they have a dry ecosystem there, drier than what we have here in the Northeast coast. So these should also be focused on mimicking an ecosystem that is actually replicable in the climate. So if we, oops, let me go back. I thought there was going to be a little circle, but since not, this screen that you can see sort of in the back here, this site was experimenting with fog catchment in order to improve some of the irrigation on their site. And they were being very selective in trying to use species that were drought resistant. But I just wanted to point out that another observation I have on these community food forests is that when people are coming together and talking about different issues that they're working with on the site, they're starting to experience drought, etc. They're experimenting with all different types of rain catchment, different species, different seeds. And so these are experimental sites and people are coming together and there's less risk when you're experimenting with these on the site rather than like on your personal farm. Here is an example in Kansas, and I see that we have Stephen Mann on this webinar, and hopefully he'll speak to this site later in the webinar when we open up for questions. But again, this is an older site, and it is open. It's in an area within a neighborhood where people can access it. There wasn't as much focus on keeping pathways as clear as if when they're located on public parks and rec property. So this is really mimicking a young woodland setting. Looking at this, you may even mistake it for just a young woodland. But as you start to actually forage into this site, you can catch glimpses of raspberries and cherries. And this site in particular shows to me how these can encourage people to start foraging, recognizing their food sources, building ecological literacy while they're doing it because they are actually within a small woodland environment. They might find pears, there's herbs to be found, there's even walking onions. So there's this whole mixture within what at first looked like a small woodland. And so this is kind of a way of discovery for people too. And I think that from the conversations I've had, etc., that is part of the enjoyment in doing this in these food forests, is watching people and sharing this discovery of how food is grown and creating this type of ecosystem. And I'll just quickly say I see a question, can this also be called permaculture? Yes, it can, and we'll discuss that more as well. So let's zoom out to the landscape level and take a look at Bloomington Community Orchard. This site started out as strictly an orchard, and over the years it has turned into what is definitely, in my opinion, a food forest because it's built in various different vegetation layers. You can see that it is located right next to a forest edge. This is on public park property. So the area that is circled, that large area is the orchard turned food forest. And this for me has particular implications for urban agroforestry, which we'll see as we start to zoom into the site. This is a little jumpy, but hopefully this plays. Oh no, maybe it's not going to play. Gregory, are you allowed to do anything on your end to have this video play? Okay, well, I was going to show you a very short video of the site so you could actually feel like you were standing in it and see what it looked like. But since we can't do that, I'm going to go forward for right now and at least show you this part. On the very edge of that food forest orchard where the forest was, this is what it looks like. So we have people experimenting with growing mushrooms next to that forest edge. So this is an opportunity for teaching people at a larger scale about forest farming. And not only is it teaching them these skills about forest farming, but it's introducing them to the process, the difficulties of it, the different products that can come out of forest farming. And in my opinion, this is a potential for opening up more of the market for forest farming products, especially when people are starting to understand that these products may not be that easy to grow, and they might be more appreciative of the cost of a particular product when it's grown a certain way. Here's a site in Portland, Oregon that I find particularly interesting. It also brings up a question whenever these sites are put into urban locations, and I do not have the particular research on this, but I do see it as a future need, and there are a few universities starting to look into this, of toxins, or what is it going to be taking up from a site. This paved parking lot is now a food forest. The owner of this particular lot was approached by some of her friends in the area who did not want to see every vacant lot or parking lot continuing to be put into construction, and they wanted a green space. They were starting an organization called Depave, and they organized a huge event, and they depaved this parking lot. So this is in 2009, after they were able to receive a grant. And part of that grant was to work with stormwater management. So I know that you can't tell super well in this photo, but these are all white water catchment devices that will be put between these two houses to catch the rainwater. And the site will be engineered in order to assist with any type of 50-year storm event, which shows another application of what these sites can do when they're fitted into an urban area. So not only did they design the vegetation layers of this food forest, they highly designed the forest floor to mimic different microclimates for catching water and is to direct the flow of any water in case there was a rain event. This is the site in 2011, 2 years later after previously being a parking lot. And this was the site in October 2015 when I visited. You may not be able to tell very well from this photo. This area is native vegetation with a water pond underneath to catch any overflow of water from the roof. And then these walkways are lower than these center areas, which were built up with a lot of soil and compost. These are rock water walkways, and this water will flow through over here where there is a larger gravel patio area with a dry well underneath that would catch water and disperse it back to the site in the event of a heavy rainfall. So let's zoom back out to the landscape level again, because that's one thing that I want people to start thinking about, is what type of application do these sites potentially have at the landscape level as well, through if they were located rather than just one in each city throughout a city. This is in Basalt, Colorado, and you can see that I think this is the Frying Pan River. I don't particularly remember the name right now, but I want to point out how closely located it is next to that river. Now, as we zoom in, this was the site in 2011, and you can see that this park, this triangular park right here that we're looking at, does not really have a lot going on. So this is a public park property located adjacent to a river and also located adjacent to a primarily low-income neighborhood with a mostly Hispanic population. This is in April 2015, so the site is a little bit drier. It hasn't had that summer yet to fill in, but this was a site that was only planted in soil was started to be prepped in 2014. Some of the initial plantings went in 2015. And I'm going to show you another photo in just a second. But as we're looking at this aerial view, This area up front is a seed garden. The people in this town were finding that when they ordered seeds, the seeds are not necessarily acclimated to their particular region. So if they were having a difficult time growing any of the seeds in their backyard, they were giving up on gardening. So this has multifunctional approach to this particular food forest. Only this part in the back is technically the area that will turn into food forest. This area is a mix of annual plants as well and is meant just for seed saving. They are partnering with the local library to help those seeds get into the community as a seed library, and hoping to use the site also for vegetative propagation and regionally acclimated species. Because they're located in the Rockies, they had to build quite a strong fence that is difficult to see here and work with Fish and Wildlife Management due to the elk and bear populations that were potentially going to be drawn in by this type of food source. So when you're working on a food forest within an urban setting, understanding who your stakeholders are is extremely important. Sarah Taylor Lovell gave a talk this summer in the same series where she talked about the multifunctionality of landscapes and stacking different functions, where on a farm, a polyculture system might have agriculture, ecological, and then cultural. I would say that that's almost reverse with community food forests, where cultural has to come first and social, as well as political, and you have to look at these different stakeholders. They also worked to have somebody translate all the materials into Spanish as well. So any of the signs that are available are welcoming and inclusive to this community that's adjacent to it. If there's ever a work party day or an event, they have a translator there on site. So these are really important factors to think about that we don't necessarily have to do when it's on private property. This is the park as you're standing within it. So I took this photo in 2014. The site had only been planted for approximately 5 months, I believe, at that point. So the majority of the work had gone into prepping the soil, building the fence, and getting a lot of composting and mulch on site. But you can see that they've already connected with a local school and are bringing students in to teach them about this ecosystem, as well as different food sources. So another that I'd like to stress, a point, is education is a huge yield of these systems. And a lot of people have been asking me, how much are they yielding in food production? The yield is more in education and food literacy and getting people engaged in their local governments to figure out the rules and regulations in order to get these type of sites on public property. And here's just another view of that food forest, where they're incorporating different type of infrastructure into the site too, so that people can enjoy it as a park as well. Okay, this is Roger Williams Park, Edible Forest Garden in Providence, Rhode Island, established in 2012. This site is interesting to me because it has a strong master gardener network attached to it, which is a great stakeholder group to involve. So for this particular site, they had an intern who went through a permaculture design course. And after the permaculture design course, that person worked with the local master gardener group to then take some of the master gardeners through what they had learned. That was part of the agreement. And so over the course of months, the master gardeners also went through all the permaculture design materials, and together they designed this garden. We're zooming out to take a look. This is located within Roger Williams Park. And as you can see, Roger Williams Park, this green area, is surrounded by a lot of water. This area here is the Botanical Center. And this area is what we're going to focus on. So the food forest that we're looking at is right here. To me, that signifies that this is also serving as a riparian buffer. This is what that little peninsula looked like in 2010. When think 2011 might have been the year when they first looked at this site. There had been already plans in the process to put in a community garden here, but this area was going to remain untouched. Although it's not quite visible, there is a historical trail map that goes through this entire park, and part of that trail goes along this edge of this area. So that's a key point to consider because it came into the planning process. This is what came out of the permaculture design course, this mix of polyculture, to be planted on that edge. They also did a long-term planning process. So looking at how this site was going to go through successional stages 30 years out, which has been pretty rare in the sites that I've seen, that they're planning for successional stages that long term. This is what it actually looks like once it was implemented on the site. And now I'm going to take you down into this area so you can see what it looked like when I saw it. Oops, sorry. We'll do that in 1 second. Just going back out to the aerial view that you saw in 2010 when it was completely bare. Now the community garden is put in there. And this is the site area that we're talking about. With master gardeners, they put in different installations every summer in this outlying area. This was the main part that was planted, and we're going to take a look at that right now. So now standing down there in that actual site, this is what it looks like. And you can see how the plants start to blend into the tree that were already existing in the site. And I want to point out this area. This is a turtle nesting area that they were not expecting when they planned the site. But after a couple years of being established, they started seeing these nesting turtles in there. To me, that signifies that this area is starting to serve as a habitat. And although it may not be mimicking a complete forest ecosystem at this point, it is providing ecosystem services and benefits. Okay, it looks like we're missing a photo on the top of this one, but that's okay. The photo on the top showed the little girl that's on the bottom right and her family walking through the site and looking at some of the different plants as well. This site had hazelnut, elderberry. She's looking at a chestnut tree. They are partnering with the Chestnut Foundation to have some of the trees planted from there along the property. And they also had plants that had some sort of historical value since they were located along that trail on that outer edge, such as New Jersey tea, which is a perennial that was used as a tea source during the Boston Tea Party. So there's different cultural elements that can be included into these sites. At the same time, they're introducing people to what species that are typically grown in larger agroforestry systems look like. And again, seeing that process of any of the difficulties they might face growing, what they look like, and increasing that food literacy. We've got one photo missing from this slide as well. I'm not sure why. But the photo that I had up here in this corner was just a closer look at that turtle nesting habitat that I pointed out in the previous slide. They've also put up these different bee boxes to encourage pollinators to be at the site. And this is a wasp that was at the site. So just showing there is variety beyond just the bee population. But these urban food forest sites are great resources for pollinator species, and particularly when they're taking extra special care to put bee boxes up, which is at quite a few of the sites, and include a lot of perennial species, flowering species, a variety of them to provide forage. Oh, there it goes. Okay, this is in Pasadena, California. I'll start to go through this a little more quickly so that we have time for talking. This is just an example of a site that was very brown, as you can see, and the church was actually going to get fined from Pasadena, City of Pasadena for their water use in watering this site. So they partnered with a local transition group that had also taken a permaculture design course and decided to completely redo the landscape, picking native species and drought-tolerant species. because there are a few fruit trees at this corner that's near the bus stop over here, and there was enough layers, 3 different layers. So this was included in my research, although it's never going to completely mimic a forest ecosystem due to the climate conditions and the fact that they want to keep certain parts of this a little bit lower so that people can walk through there. It can be a restorative place, and you can actually see the church. This is what it looks like a little bit closer to the church and the walking path. So it still does mimic walking through a perennial polyculture system that includes some annual growing beds and a lot of edible flowers as well. This particular patio area was constructed by Caltech, the university there with engineering students, so that this is collecting water and dispersing it to the site below it. This is the oldest food forest that I know of, community food forest on public property. It's in Nashville, North Carolina. And this is what the site looked like when Jonathan Brown and his wife Samantha started a nonprofit back in 1997 and talked with Parks and Rec property to find an area that was underutilized. And this points out that a lot of these urban food forestry systems are going in on very marginalized lands, and that's something that needs to be considered in the design as well, but it also shows the application of what these type of designs can do to marginalized land. This is the site as it's being constructed, and they put in a cypress walkway through the site because it is a little bit at the bottom of a hill. This is a year after planting. They did a lot of soil prep. And this is the site in 2014, which shows a dramatic difference in the understory compared to those original photos I showed you of more of a young woodland type of approach. So much more shaded and not as many vegetation layers. And you can see particularly in this part that it's very shaded. Local residents had started to complain that this area was actually too dark. They didn't necessarily feel safe walking through it. And just recently, in the last couple of months, there's been a controversial cutting down of 3 of the apple trees and a chestnut tree, which just highlights all these different factors that need to come into play and how important stakeholders are in understanding everybody's need for that place. So what is motivating people to organize and establish these different sites? If you want to read more of my thoughts on that, you can look up this article in Inside Agroforestry. But I'm going to quickly go through some of them right now. I've pulled these from conversations I've had along with different websites that are promoting these sites. So people want to be growing food, of course, but in a way that's for self-sufficiency and for almost type of a sharing economy, a governing of the commons and taking back this public space, making it multifunctional. Where at one point public parks were more of like a pleasure ground where people could go and reconnect with their agrarian lifestyle, which was a pastoral landscape, and just stroll through them and be restored. And then they turned more into areas where we could go and we could recreate with sports and have hiking trails. Now we see something else happening. People also want to be growing food increasingly in public parks and using that as another form of recreation to bring community together. So they're providing educational opportunities. They're places for people to gather together. They want to rehabilitate their local ecosystem so people are becoming environmentally aware of what's going on in their cityscape. They want to improve public health, not just through food access, but also seeing these sites as stormwater management and potential for reducing heat island effect in cities, clean air, and climate impact is on a lot of people's mind. I've heard resiliency come up, particularly with climate acclimated seed sources and vegetation. Increase food security. Celebrate food. This is where we're talking about these sites feeding into a different type of culture around food. And they want them to benefit all species. So again, bringing in those pollinator species, providing bird habitat, and seeing that it's not just for humans. Seed saving is very important. Providing propagation material in a genetic seed bank or repository, particularly a sustainable supply of local organic seed, especially when people may not trust where organic seed is coming from or just wanting more control over how they can access it and share it with people. I've taken a couple different statements that I have up here from my research. When I would ask people about these sites, permaculture was predominantly what was cited as people having as a knowledge source of how to design these sites. And when I would talk to them about agroforestry, these were some of the different comments that came up in conversation. That agroforestry is kind of the next evolution. Specifically because food forests, in my definition, are much more than just food. Here we're growing a lot of fodder for the chickens and the goats and the alpacas. I should point out, this particular food forest was down the road from one of my research sites. It was open to students and school groups and people that booked tours to come and work on it. And it was providing some of the seed that was going into the public food forest. I did not fully include the site in my research because it wasn't 100% open to the public. But what they were talking about doing in their site and what they're teaching to others, I found very interesting, especially in the sense of agroforestry. They're growing material. They're not just growing food. They're growing material for basketry. They're growing nettles and medicinal plants. And they're growing fiber. They're doing row-style crops, which of course in agroforestry language makes me think of alley cropping. And they're growing plants that are just growing to take care of other plants, like nitrogen-fixing species and companion planting. Another person said that a food forest to me is more along the lines of what I'd see at a farm scale or kind of significant acreage, something that's large and has kind of the self-maintaining nature of a forest. So this is where scale comes into play. And some of the sites that I was showing photos of, as they grow in, some of them will have a denser canopy in the middle. Some will always have a lot of forest edge. I also saw quite a few sites that I would consider more perennial edible landscaping rather than an actual large enough site to be considered forest. But this also speaks to when they are thinking of agroforestry, that it may not be possible in just such a small space, and it's something that has to be done at the farm scale. Another person talked again about scale and thinking about agroforestry. They weren't overly familiar with the word, but they hooked onto the part of forestry and said, you know, you might have the academic terminology more clear than me, but the system isn't as self-maintaining as that. Nobody irrigates the forest. And when I was hearing this again, scale popped out to me, but so did academic terminology. And yes, they knew I was a researcher coming to talk to them. But this was kind of a theme too, that agroforestry was tied more to this research and institution and agency approach. And so maybe it wasn't as accessible to the general public to use agroforestry in these type of settings, and permaculture was more understandable. So these are sites that I have not added to my map that I mentioned in the beginning. I know that they've been popping up still. This one is in Normal, Illinois. And I pulled out a few parts that were interesting to me. One, noting that one of the people involved is part of Extension. So there's an outlet in Extension, potentially in need of training of trainers, or people that are Extension workers that know about these systems and are working on it, to get more involved because the questions are going to keep happening to Extension, in my opinion. And this one is also going in Parks and Recreation property. So again, all these different stakeholders are coming into play and providing an outlet and a location for urban agroforestry. This site will be 1.4 acres, so that's not necessarily, you know, the agroforestry could be put in on such a site. A food forest takes root in Lentz. This is in near Portland. And I had highlighting on here, which unfortunately isn't showing up right now, but I will try to say a few of the different parts. This site is talking about how they're doing this for pollinators. They also talk about the size of the site. This is a fairly small site, and they're pointing out that for food access again. When these sites originally go in, a lot of people end up citing food access and healthy food and potentially putting them near low-income neighborhoods. That brings a whole nother level of having to understand, again, those stakeholders and how to bring them into this inclusive environment and to find out if they even want a food forest. But also as people go on and start doing establishment in the site and management, I've overwhelmingly heard that they do realize food may not be produced until 3 to 5 years out, depending on how many fruit trees are included and nut trees, but that there is huge yields in educational knowledge and in community building. And so again, that multifunctionality, social and cultural and human building skills are coming to the forefront before the food yields. Mixing in annuals does help with that, and a lot of sites are not excluding annuals from these systems. This one I thought was kind of funny because it starts out saying, well, this sounds a little hippy-dippy. What is this food forest idea? But what really drew my attention to it was this bottom part. I don't know if we can see it. That it's a 60-acre section of a 158-acre park. So these people that were originally saying this is only something that can be done at the farm scale. Well, here's a possibility in an extremely large public park if somebody's willing to give up that amount of land, because that also means that they now have community members coming in and helping to manage that land rather than having to spend money on mowing it. So these sites continuously keep coming up, and they're going to continue to keep coming up. I don't think that they're going to stop anytime soon. So what implications do they have for applying agroforestry to the urban landscape? How to broaden the use and understanding of temperate agroforestry. Whereas in tropical agroforestry, home gardens, forest gardens are very common, and although they may not be put onto public land, particularly in rural landscapes, many people have them around their houses, and there's a lot of sharing of the different crops between neighbors. Are there potential for citizen science initiatives or producing other yields in the different forms of capital that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk that should be incorporated into design and management? This slide is kind of small to see, but what I wanted to point out is that there's different language that exists in our agencies already. This is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, multi-story cropping standards, where they're talking about plantings consisting of overstory trees or shrubs with an understory of specialty or agronomic crops or forage. Food forestry can of course fit into these type of standards. And so how can we start blending it more and also being aware of the variety of language that's being used to describe something that's a similar site, or understanding what language describes a certain continuum of site development from perennial polyculture to multi-story cropping to a mature forest potentially with forest farming in it. There's all of these different type of language out there that could be confusing people as well. The USDA Agroforestry Strategic Framework that is ending this year probably has more goals that apply to this, but I just decided to pull out a couple. Where the strategic goal number 2 for science, one of them is to improve the application of agroforestry in creating diversity and building landscape level resiliency to climate change impacts, showing you what people were talking about, where some of these sites are located along riparian buffers or within public parks. I think they have the ability to do this. And also another goal of integration. There's social benefits of agroforestry to the full spectrum of land users, tribes, communities, and urban to rural. And you have to include a lot of different stakeholders. Demonstration sites that increase acceptance and understanding of agroforestry. These definitely have an ability to do that, but only if we are tying agroforestry language to the site and reaching out to the people that are doing these to connect with them and form allies and start blending both of the permaculture and agroforestry world in order to understand that there's a huge overlap between them and that they can also strengthen each other in certain areas as well. A few of the potentials for urban agroforestry that I see for agroforestry in a general sense is meeting that climate resiliency with the climate acclimated seed sources and propagation material. Within our cities, looking at how they might be able to be used for multifunctional riparian buffers, particularly if a parkland has been located on that, because it's an otherwise marginalized property where it's not going to be built on eventually. Education. Further research is needed on scale. And it's potentially increasing markets for agroforestry products because people are starting to learn about these different products that are produced in agroforestry systems. And it's increasing foraging opportunities within cities as well. There's a subpopulation in most cities that are doing foraging on urban forest lands at this point. I'm open to questions. That's sort of where I wanted to end the talk and wrap it up. So we at least have a few minutes for questions from people to talk about these systems, and I'd love to hear from people after seeing more of the landscape view of where these are fitting in certain landscapes, what you think the implications are for broadening the scope of agroforestry. And I haven't been able to pay attention to the chat on the right completely, but I saw permaculture pop up a few times. And yes, these systems can definitely be called permaculture. They, as I mentioned, they can be called a variety of things, and that is sometimes confusing and may isolate certain disciplines and areas of study to be involved. But in looking at them in the urban landscape, we can pull information from so many more sources that we may not currently be using in agroforestry on a farm system. So there's landscape architecture, urban forestry, of course, horticulture, urban agriculture, social justice, food systems, local food systems. There's all these different streams of information coming in, and quite a few of them have different words to describe such a site. So I'll leave it there. I agree with somebody in the chat that these are one of the oldest systems and probably one of the most widely used, I would venture to say, in the world as well. And we have a lot to learn from looking at First Nation use of these systems on temperate areas like the US. Uh, information is being researched on that as well to see what was done in the past. So with that, I'll end and leave it open for some questions. Oh, and I should have mentioned, yes, I am working with my advisor, John Munsell. We will be making a book available through Chelsea Green Publishing on a lot of the information from my dissertation, but also bringing out these different disciplines and what they have to offer to these systems and looking at some of the case studies and the project management phases and how can you look at these different capitals to really understand all the assets that are being built through these systems. And that will be available next fall through Chelsea Green Publishing. I'm sure it'll also be on Amazon. And you're welcome to email me with any further questions on that as well. My dissertation is not yet available online. You can check my website. I was trying to put topics up there. I've failed on keeping that up as I'm writing the dissertation, but the map is probably the most useful on the website, and you can go and click on the different icons and the names of sites, and anytime I've found a link to a site will be there so you can check through different ones. So, Gregory, I don't know how to scroll through. The chat window is really small. Could we enlarge it to see if there's questions people might have? My quick question is, are you inserting the agroforestry configuration? Oh, that's from the past one. Maintenance takes dedication and a budget. Yes. Okay, Amy Jackson, I see that you are bringing up an issue on maintenance of the trees and underlying vegetation. The public will not want to harvest if an area looks unkept. Excellent point. That's where the landscape architecture discipline can come in. It's very important for aesthetics to be considered, as well as safety concerns on any type of public property. So that's something that typically comes up through the planning process. And if it's on public property, often a landscape architect needs to sign on the design, and those type of things should be considered. Ones that I've seen that are open to the public on vacant lots are definitely grappling with that issue, where some of them really want to mimic that forest ecosystem, but they may not be as welcoming to some people that are not used to going into that type of environment.
Thanks, Catherine. Can everyone hear me now? Oh, good. Yeah, it seems I had a problem with my mic for a minute there. Um, so as you can see, there's a Q&A, a question and answer box here. There should be a dialog box at the bottom of that where participants you can write in any questions. While we're waiting for some more questions to come in, there were a few that were coming through in the chat box. I'm going to go ahead and ask a question myself while we're waiting for some of the questions to come in, Catherine. I'm wondering if in your research, were you able to consider or get any information at all on sites that where community food forests had been proposed but were not successful, if they didn't ever come to fruition? Because I found it very interesting your point there that really when we're talking about these community food forests, first and foremost, we really have to consider the cultural, the social, and the political dimensions and work along those factors to really before we can even begin to have some of these be approved and planned and established. Were you able to consider sites that had been proposed but never came to fruition, and maybe what some of the factors were that led to what those barriers were, and I guess conversely, what are some of the key factors for success in establishing some of these food forests?
Right. No, unfortunately, I was not able to include ones that were unsuccessful, although I would love to follow up with that. I did have a few sites that were in the planning process that would contact me, and I heard back from one of them. One of the reasons it was going slow was due to finding funding in a budget, although the local agencies were relatively interested in it. I should also point out these are becoming more and more publicized, and so talking to local agencies is easier, whereas some of the ones that started in 2008, 2009 were really kind of like pioneers in this happening. And liability and maintenance are two of the major things that come up. Um, this actually ties into one of the questions of concerns about urban pollution and the quality of food. Definitely also an issue if you're using this on a vacant lot or to rehabilitate a site. What might that mean for the quality of food that you're opening up now to free public access? Um, some of the ways people have worked through that, and what I would say is one of the most important things to do, is that if it is going to be on public property, again, the stakeholders, forming that support group. People have said you need to be flexible. You might go in with this great design that you want to do, but there's going to be policies, there's going to be regulations that people are going to have to conform to a little bit or learn how to creatively fit within or potentially lobby to change. And that's where another yield of these comes in, is that people are starting to learn how to be civically engaged. How do you do this governance? How do you work with local agencies? In the case of Beacon Food Forest, it took 3 years. They're on water conservation land on a water reservoir. It took 3 years to work through a lot of the ins and outs of local agencies, finding an umbrella group that could offer volunteer liability. So there's ways to do it, but it may take time. People are going to need patience and ability to work with people who have different viewpoints and to take those concerns into consideration.
Thank you,
What is
Catherine.
the cost or range that might be expected to hire a permaculturist to design a food forest? Excellent question. I really do not know. Um, my guess is that there is quite a large range on that. So I'm sorry I can't give you a more exact question or
Yeah,
answer.
thanks. You see some questions coming in now. Whoops, excuse me, my mic's a bit.
Oh, did want to say too, in the concerns about urban pollution and influencing quality of food, I encourage you to check out the work that University of California, San Diego is doing. You can Google Ocean View Growing Grounds, and that is supported by the Global Arc organization along with UC San Diego. They have a urban food forestry site combined with a community garden that has a variety of research going on about it, and one of them is looking how toxins are taken up in the edible tissue of the plants. And so that is some ongoing research that will be starting to look at this. books on the reading list? I have a long list, and I'd be happy to send that out. Um, Dave Jackie's Edible Forest Gardens gives a good, it's thick, but it gives a good overview of how you should really think of these ecosystems, and that although food forests is what's becoming the popular terminology to describe them, a forest may not be what can always be replicated in every environment. And so this is using ecological principles to help design these systems. Um, what else is on my reading list? There's been so many, any type of systems thinking research. Please email me and I'll be happy to send a list. Drawing a blank right now, but there's a long list.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me now?
Okay, and
I
someone wanted me to repeat the websites again. I'm just going to type them in here.
Catherine, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, good, good. I was having a little trouble with my mic here. Um, great. Thanks for the presentation. There's still a few more questions I think that have come in if you're able to see them. I don't know if you saw a question from, just one second, please. A question from, bear with me one second, please.
Hmm.
Great. We have a question here from someone in our live audience. That's great. Thank you. I think so. Let's see if this is going to work here. All right. It should be working. Here you go. This is Hannah Hemagarn.
Great. Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I've really enjoyed keeping up with your work on your website, and I was just curious to know a little bit more about the decision-making structures in these groups. I imagine it varies quite a bit, but it seems like with any community project, and especially one that requires a fair bit of management and design planning, that that could be a sticky territory. How have you seen that work out?
Right. Usually there is a core group of people, anywhere from 3 to 5 people, that really initiate the idea and start going after it. And that's the group that starts making some of the initial decisions and reaching out to other stakeholders to see if this is possible. And then after that, there's kind of like another level of stakeholders that they realize that they should probably open it up to the public and get some opinion on designs. So a lot of sites are start to go after consensus. Find that might be really difficult and long process. Some of them stick with it. Some go to consent rather than complete consensus. And there's been a variety of different ways that people go about it. What has come out of some of the groups is saying a governance structure is really important to establish up front and to do a few different subcommittees. One that is for operations and getting the budgets in place, another one that is for design and collecting information from the community, and another one that's probably focused on volunteer and outreach and education, because those are some of the main components and can be really overwhelming for just one core group to be working on at a time. So establishing that soon is helpful. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but I hope
Yeah,
it helps a
yeah,
little bit.
that's great. Thank you. Oh, and so Mike Gold is here wondering if any of the sites have recruited AmeriCorps volunteers.
Yes. Well, actually, Mike, I'm thinking of Conservation Corps. I'm not 100% sure on AmeriCorps, but Beacon Food Forest, I know, used Conservation Corps to help with all the hardscaping and originally getting the site prepped for planting with some of the funding that they had. And it's a great idea. My only concern with that would be that AmeriCorps volunteers are temporary, and part of getting the buy-in for these sites is having somebody involved that's going to stay within that community.
Thanks, Catherine. Let's see, just reviewing some of the other questions that have come in. Alexa Poindexter asked about any good resources for implementing a community food forest. Well, similar to H.D. Hilton's question about books, tops, resources. So I think what we can perhaps do is follow up. Wait a year, and we'll see your book come out. Very good point. But
Right.
perhaps we can follow up with the participants and send by email a list of recommended resources that some of the ones that you mentioned. Um, Let's see, are there any other questions that have come in? We have Adolfo here in our live audience who's visiting us from Italy as a postdoc researcher. And go ahead, what's your question, Adolfo?
If more from a farmer's point of view, but I seem to observe that with imported pests and diseases, in addition to the older ones, it's becoming impossible to get anything edible out of a fruit tree if you don't spray or control or somehow. And in a urban situation, you are unlikely to do it, and in a mixed crop system, you're more unlikely to do it. I was wondering how you choose your crops, your varieties of species, and if this is a big issue or not.
Right. Um, I can't give you a lot of information on that since I focused a lot on the social aspects, but I definitely visually saw that some fruit trees were having pest and disease issues at these sites. I did not encounter any sites that were using any type of spray. They were trying to do um, everything organically and with the least amount of input. But I think that quite a few sites, especially the older ones, were starting to grapple with that um, issue, and also realizing that they may not have access to extension or horticulture specialists that could help within that setting. That was a frustration that was voiced a few times. I know at Bloomington Community Orchard, they were using some sort of traps hanging from a lot of the different trees, and I did not completely inquire into that. So yes, it is an issue. I think it also, again, is a great educational point because it's showing people that it's not necessarily easy to grow some of these crops within those type of constraints and what farmers are facing in the field.
Thank you, Catherine. Are there any more questions either here or any coming in from participants online? I'm not seeing any come in, Catherine.
I don't
I
see
think
any
then
either.
I think we'll thank you very much for such an excellent presentation. Uh, this has been
Thanks for having me. That's good.
thanks, yeah, and I think as I mentioned, we'll follow up with send out an email to the participants for any resources that you recommend. Please also know that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted and viewable on the agroforestryinaction.org website. This has been an Agroforestry in Action webinar, um, a production of the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. My name is Gregory Ormsby Maury, your host. Please join us next time. Starting again in the spring, we'll have a series of webinars. And again, check back to agroforestryinaction.org for updates and schedule and recorded webinars. Thanks everyone for participating. Bye-bye. Thanks, Catherine.
Mm-hmm.